and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Sami Sorang, and joining me here in the program is our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the program.
Good to be back. Thanks.
Arirang World's first satellite broadcast hit the airwaves on August 12, 1999, some 20 years ago. Over the following 2 decades, Arirang World has expanded its reach to become a global television network, promoting the country's national image. So on this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we'll be talking about the current role and future outlook of international media broadcasters in commemoration of Arirang World's 20th anniversary. So Kelly, what kind of people watch Arirang TV or Arirang World back home in your country?
You know, when I was living in the U.S., I mostly watched it through YouTube, and particularly during live events that I wanted to see like a Korean perspective on. So for instance, any kind of high-level meetings or things like that. At that time, there was also the impeachment of President Park Geun-hye, so I tuned in online for that. But I would say in the United States, it's usually people who are already interested in Korea and have access to it. I know a lot of people who work in policy in Asia and DC who watch Arirang, and then I've also heard of K-pop fans watching as well.
Okay.
Just recently, a colleague visited me here from DW, the broadcaster that I'm working for, and his wife is Korean, and he always watches it like out of private interest, not professional interest, and he gave me a good feedback about Arirang, and he might be actually watching the show today too. And also, I know that, for example, within the German community in Korea, for example, at the German Chamber of Commerce, Arirang is always running in the background, and I think it's a good way, to stay up to date, to see what's the latest discourse in Korea.
Okay. And Frank?
Well, just to echo what they've said, you have a couple of different subcultures probably watching the program back home in Canada, in my case. One would be those that are interested in K-pop and the cultural aspects that are part of Arirang's program. Another one would be the foreign policy people that are interested in what's going on geopolitically here in South Korea and the region, and they would be watching as well as Kelly and Fabian mentioned, those with particular connection to South Korea. There are a lot of Koreans that live in Canada. Certainly they're probably watching a bit of Arirang too, especially the second generation ones whose Korean might not be that good and whose first language might be English. They might watch Arirang again to keep up with what's going on here in South Korea.
So people who already have an interest in Korea, whether it be the politics, policies, or soft power, so culture and entertainment.
Sure.
That main audience. Now, if we have a look at the history of international broadcasting, the world's first international broadcasters were established in the early part of the 20th century. With many countries around the world using satellite broadcasts to promote their national interests, the South Korean government felt compelled to keep up by creating Arirang TV. What's the main purpose of international broadcasting stations?
Well, I think it's really to provide a different perspective on international affairs than is given through other types of media, commercial and other types of media, and also to provide, as you mentioned, that perspective that reflects the national interests of different countries. You mentioned also how other broadcasters were born in the early 20th century. Those national broadcasters developed an infrastructure that became kind of, you could argue, the dominant media environment that set the agenda in terms of global political discourse. Now, through Arirang and other state broadcasters that are developing, that are broadcasting in English, just like Arirang, that mainstream media dominance is being challenged, and new perspectives on international affairs are being introduced to the public discourse, which I certainly favor.
Now, Fabian and Frank, you guys both work for international stations. What sort of role do you play there? And if you could give us a brief background of how that station was established?
Well, I work for a couple of different stations. One is Radio Television Hong Kong in Hong Kong, obviously. The other one, the main one that I work for in terms of broadcasting, is Press TV, which is Iran's English language broadcaster. In terms of Press TV, our agenda is to provide a alternative perspective on international affairs from the dominant mainstream news media that I described earlier. And that's a really big challenge because that mainstream media really dominates, according to many people, the international news environment and the international news agenda. And so, our role at Press TV is to provide an alternative perspective on international affairs.
And what about Deutsche Welle? How was that established?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because you see how the Times really reflected also on Deutsche Welle, on the international news channel. It was established in 1953, but actually even before that, Germany had an international broadcaster, international radio, and for example, during the Nazi time, there was totally abused for broadcasting propaganda and also mobilizing for the war. So after the Second World War, when Deutsche Welle was established, the first role at that time was basically to provide a service for Germans living abroad, to catch up with the latest news. Then there was a separation of East Germany and West Germany, and then Deutsche Welle became more engaged in promoting democracy and freedom of press. And then later on, for example, after the war in Afghanistan, there was also a big turning point for Deutsche Welle because they then engaged in building up the media landscape there. And I think nowadays the big challenge is to cope with the change in media, basically getting more online and digital. And also Deutsche Welle has service in 30 different languages. That's, I think, also one of their unique strengths. And for example, the Arabic service is really popular in Egypt. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Which aspects of South Korea should Arirang TV focus on promoting to audiences abroad?
Well, from my opinion, what I really appreciate about Arirang is, let's say, for example, if there's a really important speech or so, then there's always some live translation into English interpretation. So that's my professional viewership. But in terms of what I would like to watch, I would really like to get to know more about contemporary South Korea, but beyond K-pop and all those hypes, but learn more about society in a nuanced way. And sometimes I have the feeling that how Korea is promoted, it's a little bit too simplistic. It's too much of a rosy picture, so it's not a realistic point of view sometimes. But actually, that's exactly what I think many viewers, maybe in Europe, would be really interested to learn more about, what are the conflicts in the society? What are the problems also of young people? Not only critical stories. That's not what I mean. But getting a more nuanced, differentiated view.
I think that's a really important point to make in terms of the role of state broadcasters that have the funds to do programming that isn't motivated by that commercial interest. And that type of programming is that more nuanced programming. Is that socially, social value journalism that's delving into interesting aspects of society that aren't necessarily sensational or geopolitical or K-pop, but still have some function, have some journalistic function in terms of communicating what's going on in contemporary Korean society.
If I could just add something, I agree with Fabian and Frank, and I think that, more Korean language learning programming would be a good idea, just in that I've written before a couple of times for Quartz about language learning around the world, and particularly in Western countries. And what was interesting to me, and these numbers are a couple of years old, but at least in the United States, overall college enrollment in all foreign languages are down, except for Korean. and Korean is actually growing and growing at quite an exponential rate. So the interest is definitely there in terms of language resources. And as someone who is always trying to, make my Korean more natural and things like that, I found that a lot of the content out there is for really rudimentary beginning Korean and not for people of more advanced levels. And so I think, if there's any suggestion like I could make in programming, it would maybe just be more Korean language content.
Especially when you consider so many of the viewers are now video on demand. It's not like you're going to be tying up a big span of your broadcast time with language study, which might not be a good idea from a broadcasting sort of audience standpoint. Whereas if you made it video on demand, which a lot more people are going online to get their content, it could be really successful.
And you're looking for more advanced level, some medium level or advanced level of Korean.
Yes, I think this is just true in general of the language learning landscape with Korean in general.
Okay. Now, Fabian, you mentioned that you appreciate how Arirang TV is always there on the spot when a big news story breaks out. So whether it be historic, inter-Korean summers, or the Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games, every time a big story breaks out here in the country, Arirang TV is there on the spot for live, real-time coverage. Arirang TV also allocates a big chunk of its airtime to provide comprehensive background to those news stories as well. Do you think Arirang TV is doing an adequate job of representing Korea in the world stage?
Sure, I think it is. I mean, Fabian mentioned this a bit, and I do the same thing as a foreign journalist. Whenever the president is giving a big speech or there's some other big event that's going on live, Arirang broadcasts that.
Right.
And I can tell you, a lot of journalists are watching that as a source for news that they're going to put into their future reporting. So you can look at this as being a huge expense to broadcast that and to have translators do that and everything. And it might not be going out to that big an audience in terms of directly, but it has a vast influence over those other, probably several hundred journalists that are watching that feed and getting that information that they wouldn't be getting if it wasn't for Arirang.
Yeah, I think it's really important, in let's say with the North Korea conflict or some political issues. If you look at the international discourse, it's mostly shaped by, let's say, CNN or BBC. Often they ask experts who are American or expats living here, and I think the South Korean voice is usually underrepresented. So I think that's important also for Arirang to give a platform, give a forum for that.
For the local domestics to voice their opinions.
Yeah, to also get the other perspective, because usually the interests are a little bit different, and also the way how you look on things are also different, whether you're, let's say, a think tank expert sitting in Washington or whether you're based here.
Just adding on to what Fabian said, I do think that is so important. And just anecdotally speaking, I went back to the US for a month last year, around December. And just having conversations about what I do with people I met in the US and things like that, it was actually shocking what parts of South Korea they didn't understand. I think, by consuming a lot of US media, they understand that there's a North Korea issue and things like that, but it was clear that they did not understand these current events very well from a South Korean perspective. They didn't understand South Korea's history and how it intersects with the United States. They didn't understand sometimes that South Korea is like a developed world power nation. And so it was just really fascinating, and it made me think about the importance of getting news in English from the South Korean perspective. And I think Arirang obviously does that and does influence foreign journalists, as Frank said, and we can't even measure the potential impact of that.
Right.
Certainly, just to echo what Kelly mentioned, I teach media analysis course. And the first thing that I ask students that are international students that are coming to South Korea is, what's your perspective of South Korea now that you've been here for a month or 2 or 6 months, compared to your perspective of South Korea from your media consumption in your home country, from that mainstream media that I'm really trying to, in a way, battle. And they said, oh, it's completely different. I thought, that there was a whole bunch of tension and their crisis and that there was a war on here, because that's the main story that is driven by that mainstream media that really doesn't reflect the reality. And that's what the students told me. And that indicates that there's this failure in the dominant Western perspective mainstream media in communicating really what's going on in South Korea. And that testifies to the importance of Arirang television.
You know, adding to what Frank said, the number one question I get from people I meet in the US when they ask me about my work or where I live right now, they say, "Are you safe? Are you okay? Like, are you worried?" And the thing is, it makes me laugh because honestly, I'm more worried about my safety in the United States on a day-to-day basis. And so I do think that, you know, it shows that there is like such a need here for people to better understand South Korea from a South Korean perspective.
Right.
And so if they know about Arirang and they tune into that, hopefully they can get that.
And also state media has an opportunity to be a little bit more objective in terms of how they portray geopolitics and portray South Korea. Commercial media is going to be sensationalizing the conflict of North Korea in order to draw more viewers, whereas state media doesn't have to do that. They can be a little bit more independent and not worry about, you know, clickbait or how many people are going to watch their programming or advertise on their network, and take a much more responsible perspective in what they broadcast.
Now, most of these state television stations, most of these international broadcasting stations, they are run by state money. So they are public entities. So I have 3 questions on that front. The first one is, do you think it's ideal that an international broadcasting station, as the face of that country, be a public entity as opposed to a private one?
That's a tough question because it really just depends on the individual country, right? And the level of their media freedom and what they are using that broadcasting network for. So I don't know if it's an ideal scenario to be state funded. There are benefits, as Frank has touched upon, such as, you know, you're not beholden to, you know, whether or not you're going to continuously get funded based on viewership.
Right.
With that said, I'm sure there are, you know, governmental influences in some of these countries. Like maybe a state-funded network doesn't want to spend, you know, so many broadcasting hours talking about, you know, their cultural soft power, but they have to. I think, you know, these challenges always kind of exist in media in a sense when you are working with editors who are not in that country with you. You know, I'm not speaking about Bloomberg specifically, but actually other news organizations. As a reporter working for privately funded organizations, there is this constant push to almost like fight your own editor on their biases about South or North Korea. It's just that ever-existing challenge of working in media in general. As much as we'd like to say that it's perfect, it's free, it's not influenced by any top-down powers, in some ways you can argue it always is.
You can argue, but for example, in the case of Germany, I mean, I think there's the political influence is really minimal, and the reason being that, you know, under the Nazi time, the public broadcaster was basically state propaganda. Now it's a public broadcaster. It's not owned by the state. It's run by independent bodies, and regularly, political parties try to have some influence, but I think the institution is strong enough to, you know, back off and stay independent. I think that the political influence, that's the one issue. Also, if it's tax funded, there's always a question how efficiently is the money spent, because it's also, I mean, it's public money, taxpayers paying for it. And then maybe the third one is, since it's public, there's no commercial pressure. So it should not be too much on the infotainment side, like trivializing things to make it more entertaining, but also it should stay relevant. It cannot be totally a niche program.
Right.
So there's always a fine line to draw.
So whether it's commercial broadcasting stations or state-funded ones or even subscription-based outlets, the whole journalism landscape is changing with the advent of social media. Anyone with a mobile phone can become a citizen journalist by taking videos from where the event is happening. So in such a time, how can international broadcasting stations stay relevant?
I'm going to say, if you're worried about one-person journalism taking your viewers away, you've already lost the game. I think that Arirang and other state broadcasters have budgets and professional journalism that are producing content that is more valuable and more interesting than the content that could possibly be produced by a one-person journalism outlet. I myself am a one-man band producer in terms of broadcasting a lot of the time, and it's very, very challenging, but I'm not trying to do that 24 hours a day or be an entire news outlet. Individual people can't do that, even on a Facebook feed or YouTube channel or whatever it is. Sure, they're going to be out there, but there's a lot more media consumption also taking place, and I think state broadcasters and other large broadcasters and big media, I don't think that those small individual medias are really going to challenge them. The part of the media landscape that is evaporating is text and newspapers in smaller markets.
Okay.
If I may, I just feel like broadcasters in general need to get a little bit more bold and creative with their decision making. I mean, the truth is, I don't turn on TV news. I don't even have it. Like, it's not possible, right? Most of my news that I'm consuming from broadcast, it's really just uploaded to YouTube after or whatever. And I think part of that is a cultural difference. It's not just, like technology ruining the industry. I think people my age are kind of sick of the starchy, like news anchor who talks in a metered voice and like has no personality, right? And that model exists right now. It certainly has a lot more money than newspapers, but I don't know how long it will in the long run. So I feel like a lot of the successful news brands with younger people who are supposed to be the consumers that they want for life, right, are the ones that think a little bit outside of the box. For instance, Vice. Even NPR in the United States is a little more casual with the way that they talk to readers. And so I think there is this greater cultural shift. And, working in the commercial news industry, it's so funny because, I look for stories depending on what people are talking about and trending topics of Naver or Korean Twitter and things like that. And doesn't it matter if you're a foreign correspondent what South Koreans are talking about, right? But often what happens is I pitch that to a news organization and they say, what does this have to do with us? I don't care. And then a week later, something silly happens that does inadvertently involve the US, or some other competitor covers it and now they want it from me. So I think news organizations that are kind of legacy organizations also just have to be more willing to stray from the stories that everyone else is covering and do something unique. They say that they crave that all the time, but I don't know if they really do. And so I think, there's this concept of when everyone zags, someone's got to zag. And I think that, traditional broadcasters need to get more comfortable with zagging and not, flipping through the channels and seeing the same exact headlines in the scroll on the bottom, because I do think that's a problem at this point and also limits the diversity of coverage that we're getting of countries like South Korea.
Kelly, you mentioned that about commercial broadcasting stations. Do you think that also applies for international broadcasting stations as well?
Yeah, I totally agree with Kelly. I would like to add that Arirang has one advantage, I think, here, because the viewership is quite young. I think it appeals to a young audience, youthful audience. It's actually also like many journalists who run Arirang are also pretty young. So I think they get what this generation is about, and it also like the fewer and fewer people actually own a TV. Of course, they consume it on social media. So that's why after we finish recording this show here, we will post. We'll take a selfie and post it on your Instagram account, for example, right? So that's one way, like to be more present on social media, because it doesn't matter on which platform you consume the show.
All right, guys. As always, if you could summarize the future of Arirang TV or where it should be headed in your opinion as a news headline, how would you do it, Fabian?
So in my ideal view, the headline should be Beyond K-pop, take a look at contemporary South Korea.
Okay, beyond K-pop, contemporary South Korea.
Mine's the opposite, more fun on Arirang.
More fun? More in the form of culture and entertainment?
More fun on Arirang, sure.
Okay.
Mine would be Arirang goes social media savvy, rolls out big plans for Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and Snapchat.
All right, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for your insight. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good to be here.
That wraps up our discussion on the roles and responsibilities of international broadcasters as we mark the 20th anniversary of Arirang World. We'll be back next week for another debate on the latest issue. Thank you for tuning in and goodbye.